welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. President Trump says that he had received a beautiful letter from Chairman Kim Jong-un and expressed hope that something positive will happen. The president emphasized North Korea's economic potential, but also maintained that U.S. sanctions will remain. As Kim Jong-un reaches out to President Trump, North Korea continues to blame the U.S. for the failure of the Hanoi summit. What preconditions should be met before a potential third U.S.-North Korea summit?
But it was a very personal, very warm, very nice letter. I appreciate it. I think that something will happen that's going to be very positive.
We are ready and willing to continue engagement on working level negotiation.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Mark Lippert, Senior Advisor at CSIS and former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea. And also joining me is Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S. Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the studio.
Thanks, great to be here.
Welcome to the studio. Now, I want to start with President Trump's letter that he received from Kim Jong-un. Now, these letters seem to play a critical role leading up to the U.S.-North Korea summits. Why do you think North Korea is sending this letter at this time?
It's a good question. What I would say is that first, it comes down to the fact that I do think they need sanctions relief, and they do want to continue engagement. I think it's a positive sign. Having said that, the letter does feel to be insufficient in that I think many in Washington, including myself, have argued that in order for another summit to be successful, we need some sort of working level talks. So the point is, letter's good, but probably need some more things to have a third summit turn out in the direction we want it to.
Mm-hmm. Scott, how did you assess the letters?
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, the hard part about assessing the letter is that we obviously don't know everything that is in there. And yet, the concern I think that we would have in Washington is that this could be another end run around a bureaucratic process. And really the challenge is that we saw in Hanoi, a leader level process only gets you so far, and yet the devil is in the details. And unless we're able to talk between governments at the working level, those details cannot be worked out. So I think the real challenge is how you combine leader level diplomacy with working level support for a process.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to that, very good point, Scott, that I would hope that one of the lessons that the North Koreans took away from Hanoi was that there are, in fact, limits to this leader level diplomacy, and that while important, we do need exactly what you're talking about, that we do need working level talks if they are going to get into a place of some seriousness of purpose.
Mm. So if we look at the messages coming from the Trump administration, actually the National Security Advisor John Bolton said that the U.S. is open to a third potential U.S.-North Korea summit, but the key is really in Kim Jong-un's hands. And that President Trump also said that they're going to do great with North Korea, but he's not in a rush. So would this kind of message be in line with what you just also mentioned here?
Well, I think the real question is whether or not there can be alignment between the U.S. and DPRK on that question. And I see Bolton as basically saying, well, we're ready to talk when North Korea is ready to make concessions. But of course, Kim Jong-un said exactly the opposite last April in his Supreme People's Assembly speech, where he basically said, we're giving you to the end of the year in order to make a concession to us. And so that's precisely the reason why both sides need to talk in order to work out and understand what actually is necessary in order to move forward. And I actually think that the U.S. government is sending strong signals in that direction, and I believe that we're also detecting a little bit of impatience at this point with North Korea's reluctance to come back to a working level process.
Mm-hmm. How did you assess the messages coming from the administration?
Very similar. I mean, I think Scott's point about the fact that at the core of this is differences that are very tough to overcome, and we don't seem to be moving in the direction to overcome those key differences, right? That's point one. Having said that, I do think that the signals the administration, the U.S. administration, is sending by keeping the door open and continuing to try to generate some positive momentum is a very good and constructive piece of the equation. The final piece, though, I would say, and at the risk of repeating myself, is figuring out what and how will bring the North Koreans back to the table at the working level in order to hammer out, back to the first point, some of those key differences in order to move the process forward.
So if North Korea were to come out to working level talks and have constructive talks, what are some of the things that the two sides must agree upon?
Well, I think inherent in that is an agreement on what denuclearization, the definition of denuclearization is. I think that's critical and important in defining kind of an end state, if you will, and moving the process forward. Then I think you can get in, and I think this is where working level talks are important, discussion about what is possible, some of the modalities and how these are accomplished, the sequencing. These are critically important questions that often take months to resolve and try to find common areas of agreement on. These are tough issues that really it's hard to leave some of these complicated, difficult issues to a few hours at a leaders' summit. So the point here is that I think you can get an understanding, a better understanding of each side's negotiating positions, winnow the differences away, and then really try to make at the working level a common definition of denuclearization that I think will be critical in defining where we're going, not just how we're going.
So Mr. Lippert just said defining the definition of denuclearization is important in the working level talks. What are some of your takeaways of what the two sides should agree in working level talks?
Well, maybe what we can do is go back and look a little bit more carefully at why Hanoi failed, because we really didn't have those kinds of interactions. Only essentially a month of working level talks. And so the right place to, I think, pick up is where we ended. And that is Choi Sun-hee running over to Trump administration officials as Trump is leaving the room, finally saying something in response to repeated questioning about the dimensions and scope of Yongbyon, what is on the table. That's an issue that we need to sort out. It can only be sorted out with guidance from leaders through further working level engagement. And so that's where we need to pick up. I agree absolutely with Mark about the need to define the end state. And then it's really a matter of trying to craft an understanding about how one moves forward on the process of denuclearization on both sides. And the other thing I would point out is that the Special Representative Began continues to emphasize parallel and simultaneous. And he continues to point out that we have other tracks beside the denuclearization track where we actually achieved some agreement, but that cannot move forward until we have agreement on all aspects of follow-on to the Singapore Declaration.
Mr. Lippert, if we turn to North Korea, they're continuing to blame the U.S. for the failure of the Hanoi summit. So while Kim Jong-un is sending a letter to President Trump, their North Korean media continues to blame the U.S. for this. What is the intention behind North Korea?
Well, I do think there's a domestic component to this that Kim Jong-un is trying, and his leadership cadre are trying to manage. They've raised expectations about, one, a possible deal, and two, about economic reform and or at least benefit within North Korea. So I wouldn't discount a domestic political component to this in North Korea. I think the second point, though, I think the administration has done a very good job of just rising above this, generally speaking. Keeping the door open to negotiations, I think, has been important. We haven't devolved into name-calling or ad hominem attacks.
Scott, I want to take a look at the State Department's stance on the comment where they said that the U.S. remains open to pursuing parallel and simultaneous actions agreed on all the commitments made in the Singapore summit. So what is the State Department's stance here on denuclearization?
I think they still want to achieve an understanding with the North Koreans. They emphasize that it's necessary to engage at the working level. And they're really looking at following up on the Singapore Declaration as a package in which denuclearization is included from our perspective as an essential element. And I think the U.S., the Trump administration probably believes that it has already shown some seriousness of intent on establishing a new relationship and probably believes that it's prepared to send positive signals on the idea of achieving peace, and yet we're not seeing reciprocal action on the North Korean side. And that was, I think, made painfully obvious by the fact that only Kim Jong-un could make a decision on denuclearization, and when it came time for him to make the decision was not forthcoming.
I want to now take a look at whether there was any progress made since last year's Singapore summit. One of the major agreements that they agreed on was that the two leaders agreed to work towards complete denuclearization. So would you say that there has been some progress on denuclearization?
Well, what I would say is that, we've seen that some testing has stopped, right? Or testing has generally stopped nuclear missile. That's a good thing. But it's not nearly close to sufficient, right? The program is still growing. Fissile material is still being produced. I think that's the real issue here. And I think, to me, what you need to do is get a comprehensive freeze of the entire program, start down a path of a rollback, and then eventually get to zero. So we've got a very small freeze on certain elements of the programs only. I think you could technically define that as some progress, but I don't think it's nearly enough, right? And the jury is still out. So I think that's the final point I would come to. It's still relatively early, right, in terms of where we are in this rounds of negotiation, or early enough, let me put it that way, early enough in the process whereby we still can see more progress.
So there were no nuclear testings or ICBM testings, and you mentioned that there needs to be a freeze on all North Korea's nuclear materials. So as a first step, are you saying that we should get a freeze on North Korea's all of its nuclear-related materials?
What I'm saying is, I'll come back to my earlier point. I would like to see first an understanding of what denuclearization means. I think that kind of unlocks the key, unlocks a lot of these steps. Having said that, look, I will take I would be very interested in if the North Koreans tabled more comprehensive freezes, but also that has to be on the road to much deeper reductions, right? Much sooner in the process.
I just wanted to follow up. So these step-by-step approaches have been tried in the previous administrations, but it never happened. It never has been successful in bringing North Korea's denuclearization. Are you concerned that we will repeat the same history again if we take this approach?
We don't want to have enough time to revisit the whole 25 years of why certain things failed when. What I would say is that I think most people, by and large, end up to the pragmatic point that a step-by-step phase reduction is the least bad option in this case to solve a very complex problem. Having said that, look, if the leaders could get into a room and solve this in big, broad brushstrokes fast, I'm for that too. I'm very pragmatic. I'm just saying, when you look at the data tend to lead you to the conclusion that a phased rollback with, again, an upfront understanding of where we're going, right? A phased freeze, rollback, and get to zero is the most pragmatic and I think realistic opportunity to achieve denuclearization in North Korea.
Scott, you earlier mentioned that the devil's in the details. So how would you suggest a way to move forward in these negotiations?
Well, I think the best way to move forward is actually for the working level teams to meet and discuss these issues, but I also believe that they are going to need input from the leaders. And so I believe that probably some sort of meeting in Pyongyang with a U.S. team, together with North Korean counterparts, would be good, but punctuated by conversations on tough issues with the leader. And so that means that the special representative would have to be able to meet with Chairman Kim, and perhaps vice versa in terms of some rounds in Washington. But the key is that given the nature of the North Korean system and the evident difficulty of moving forward on the details, there's going to have to be regular checking in with the leadership in order to basically make space for sufficient progress. to actually push forward a deal. And I would actually also say that if we look at other processes of this sort, Iran, the European experience, there's such a level of detail involved, and we just haven't seen that forthcoming at all with the North Koreans. And so that is very worrisome, I think, from the perspective of many about whether we can really get this process moving.
That's right. And I think it's fair to say the U.S. and the South Korean side have put concrete things on the table. There's no doubt, right? I think there has been, you cannot argue credibly that the U.S. and the South Koreans have not done things to show that they are serious, right? I think that has been stipulated. And then it's to Scott's point, which is we are now in a situation, I believe, where the North needs to take some sort of commiserate, demonstrable action to show that they're serious as well.
So we're really waiting for North Korea's actions to denuclearize here.
To take credible steps to get us into a process, right? Once you get into the process, I think as Scott outlined, the process can take on a life of its own and can generate a momentum of its own. I think the key is we've got to get into a place where things are being put on the table, real discussions are being had, and regular check-ins, working level, you can even argue ministerial level, all the way up to leader level, across the board, form essentially a number of lines of operation that all lead back towards a credible path towards denuclearization.
All right, we'll leave our conversation here and move on to the next segment.
To strengthen the United States Republic of Korea alliance on efforts to achieve the final, fully verified denuclearization.
가능하다면 그 이전에 김정은 위원장을 만나는 것이 바람직하다고 생각합니다.
President Trump will be visiting South Korea following the G20 summit. The State Department says leaders of the two countries will discuss strengthening the alliance and ways to coordinate to bring North Korea's denuclearization. Meanwhile, President Moon says he hopes to meet Chairman Kim Jong-un before he meets with President Trump. What kind of breakthrough will the two countries find in the midst of stalled negotiations? Now, Scott, President Trump is going to meet with President Moon following his trip to Japan. What kind of coordination do you think that the two allies need here?
Well, if we're moving into a period where North Korea is stepping toward renewed engagement, it's going to be all the more important for the U.S. and South Korea to be on the same page. And so there are many issues to discuss, continuing pressure in terms of sanctions, but also looking at opportunities for maintaining progress and trying to ensure that North Korea is moving in the right direction or is not essentially wiggling off the hook in terms of where we're trying to go on denuclearization.
Mr. Lippert, given that you worked with the South Korean government while you were in office as well, what kind of coordination do you think the two allies need here at this time?
Well, I agree largely with Scott. I mean, I just think that the key cornerstone to a good North Korea policy is general unification among the two allies in a common approach, right? And there will be differences, right, between South Korea and the United States. There always have been, there always will be. They're two different countries. It would be weird if we agreed on everything. But it's how those differences are managed, how those differences are brought down to a minimal distance between the two, and how ultimately the two come up with a common approach that I think is critical in going forward. And I think that will be high on the agenda of the two leaders during President Trump's visit.
So when you were serving in the government, how would you assess coordination back then and right now?
It's hard to make that judgment. But what I would say is that during my time as ambassador, there was outstanding coordination. It was very, very tight. There were a lot of lines of communication, and I think it worked very well. Now, two other points. One, the North, by my tenure in Seoul, was not very interested in talking to anyone. The Chinese, the South Koreans, us, the Japanese, the Russians. There's a lot of data on that. And two, what I would also say, part of the reason I think that coordination was so effective when I was there or under late Obama, Park Geun-hye, is that the structures and institutions in the alliance have really matured over time. And those structures and institutions make it much less about the personalities and much more about the interests and the issues.
Let me just say, this is a very important point, and this is where Ambassador Lippert made some critical contributions, because the institutionalization of coordination between our two governments, I think, under the Obama administration, advanced considerably, and it makes it a lot easier for us to deal with hard problems like North Korea because we're tied together in that way.
And I want to take a look back at the last U.S.-South Korea summit held in Washington. Back then, the two sides seemed to have differences on sanctions relief, on the issue of sanctions relief, the issue of ways to achieve denuclearization, and the resumption of the inter-Korean economic projects. So would you be concerned that there would be differences again this time around?
Well, what I see from the outcome of the Moon-Trump summit is that we ended up basically on the same page. I think that it's true that some of the impulses that maybe President Moon had were constrained by that visit. But we're really on the same page in terms of the goal of denuclearization. I think that it is an essential goal for South Korea's national security, and it's also an essential goal for the U.S. national security interest.
President Moon, addressing the Swedish parliament, called on North Korea to show substantial steps in terms of dismantling its nuclear weapons program. But this is quite a contrast when he emphasized sanctions relief for North Korea when he was addressing European countries last year. Would you say that the message from President Moon changed to North Korea, or would you say this is geared towards his domestic political audiences?
And I would just echo what Scott said. The two sides have come much closer together in terms of where they think the issues lie in terms of the North Koreans' need to come back to the table. So I think that's a very positive step. I'd also echo Scott's comment that, look, you can go into summits or into negotiations far apart. It's how you come out of them that's critical. And I think what we've seen now is really a much more unified approach between the two allies. I think the lines of communication have gotten stronger over the last couple of years. And so I think that's all headed in the right direction in terms of the U.S.-ROC relationship and alliance.
Scott, what is your take on it?
Well, you know, when Moon went to Europe last year, he was really coming off the emotion of the Pyongyang summit. And I think that he might have been a little bit more forward-leaning than the reality justified at that moment. And I think that the comments this year are probably much more sober and more realistic in terms of the magnitude of the challenge that North Korea poses in terms of its reluctance to commit to denuclearization.
We'll wrap up our segment here and move on to looking at our photo of the week. This week, we have a picture of a health clinic in North Korea. This picture was taken marking World No Tobacco Day, where North Koreans are urged to quit smoking. There is a poster written in Korean that reads, "Quit smoking, that's bad for you." What do you make of this photo?
Well, it reminds me of Kim Jong-un smoking near missile testing sites, and it reminds me that the rules don't necessarily apply to the leader.
Well, I just say as an impression, it just always reminds me of the serious ongoing health issues in North Korea. I mean, and I hate to bring it to such a serious issue. The smoking and health nexus leads me down the road of the TB issues and all the real problems in the North that are left untreated.
Yeah, I found it very contradicting because North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, is known to be a very heavy smoker. That's the end of today's Washington Talk. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's all for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America. Thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.